Awesome. And so I will actually go ahead and click through to my quick introduction of self. So I have been with the University of Wisconsin-Madison Division of Extension since 2020. I had grown up on a cranberry marsh. As Hugh said, I'd worked at University of Minnesota and University of Nebraska in ag engineering, specifically soil pH, soil physics, soil chemistry, and then spent the last 7 years in row crop. But then University of Wisconsin invented this Cranberry Outreach Specialist position. And I said, okay, I've been doing agronomy and I've been loving it, but this is my opportunity to go back home to Wisconsin and work in my favorite crop of all time. I get to help my folks on weekends again. So my folks still run the home cranberry marsh. And things have been really lovely on that front. In my work at University of Wisconsin, I started right at the beginning of the pandemic. So we dove right into doing virtual brown bags, which are monthly sessions where we meet growers and specialists together and crop consultants and IPM scouts to give a timely update of what's going on. I've been working on video interviews that you can see kind of gradually growing our YouTube presence. The Cranberry Crop Management Journal, which has been running for many years before I arrived, along with our nutrient management and pesticide applicator trainings. I work on our research roundtable that connects all of our grower questions with our research so that our researchers are working on questions that growers actually have and find most important. Sherlock Holmes field visits, kind of like Hugh mentioned, to come out and visit marshes, as well as when you have head scratcher questions that haven't been answered otherwise. And then I also work on pesticide screening trials, and as Hugh was mentioning, with the lower question, lower acreage, higher value crop special use pesticide registrations. Those are, of course, very important for us. And I will also just answer, since Lloyd mentioned being interested in weed control and organic cranberries. That is, of course, an ongoing and evergreen question, unfortunately. I have seen everything from hand weeding to, we've done flamethrowers in the past, to having, when I was a teenager, went out with a sickle and took all of the seed-bearing tops off of things before they would fully go to seed. There are more growers that have specialized in organic, and so I would probably I'll make Hugh some recommendations. Within Wisconsin, we have one IPM scout who is kind of got an organic specialty, and then a couple of growers that are willing to share. And so I might recommend them for upcoming talks that Hugh could host with you. And then as I go into this presentation, and we're here, it's a shame that my computer doesn't show the time at the same time as my presentation. So we're going to be here together for just over an hour. So it's, I think, until you're 11:30. I have what I give generally as two presentations, and they are the kind of chemistry heavy, how nutrients get into plants, that I often give with our nutrient management trainings, and that dovetails with Hugh's appropriate levels of nitrogen use, which of course cranberry growers already do. We're obviously very careful about it because where corn has no crop drawbacks, if you apply too much nitrogen, cranberries of course do. So we're very careful with that. And then I have a second presentation that is an update of what you guys are probably familiar with, the 2020 nitrogen use in bearing cranberries. We've come a long way in just terms of grower practices and grower on-farm research in those 22 years. And so I've got some sections where I'll talk about what Wisconsin growers are doing differently and updated since that last publication went out. So I'll kind of dive in, and if you guys have questions as we go, also feel free to ask questions, whether they're on topic or off topic. This is about you guys, and I am happy to take whatever path is going to lead to the most learning. So we're going to kind of talk about quickly how plant and soil factors result in nutrient uptake and availability. We're going to talk about our main macronutrients, so nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium. their roles, how they're available, and how to manage them. And there we go. So you guys will already be familiar with, of course, your macronutrients are nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, magnesium, calcium, and sulfur. Micros occasionally will have, boron applications, manganese, but by and large are not our restricting elements of cranberry production. I like to think about nutrients being available to plants. They have to be there. They have to have a mode of getting into the plant. And they have to have then, if that is, mass transfer, they need to have moisture to be able to do that. So most of our fertilizers are salts. They're either a positive charge or a negative charge. When we have moisture in our soil, the soil solution, these salts will dissolve so that we'll be able to have the plant take up the nutrient in that ion dissociated form. The roots have binding sites that are going to selectively take up nutrients. And so these are going to say, I am looking for a 2+ charge, or I am looking for a 1- charge. I am looking for a 1+ charge, and they can receive nutrients that match those connection sites. So we have, as you apply fertilizer during the growing season, it's a very, very small part of the soil that actually has your roots in it. And so the luck of having a fertilizer, if many of you are organic, you're probably using like 4-6-4s, chicken litter sorts of things. But whether you're using 4-6-4 or triple 11, you are very rarely going to actually contact the root directly with a pellet. The way that most nutrients are going to get into the plant is with mass flow. So the nutrient has to be present, and then you also have to have moisture in a pathway that's conducting those ions toward the plant. And then diffusion is the other major way. So mass flow for nitrogen, magnesium, and calcium, you have these ions dissolved in the solution, you have water flowing, and then your cranberry root takes up that ammonium, so that +1 charge that it's been looking for. And again, as cranberry growers, you are already familiar with the fact that cranberries use ammonium forms of nitrogen rather than nitrates. So all row crops tend to use nitrates. Ammoniums, when we have our low pH zones, nitrogen exists naturally in that ammonium form, which is great because it doesn't leach the way nitrates do. And that is one of the cool quirks that our crop developed by evolving in very low pH soils. So you are going to have the competition between magnesium and calcium. So they're both 2+, and the plant, again, is kind of blind to whether this is a magnesium ion or a calcium ion. All it sees is this is a 2+ charge, and so it's grabbing them. And so it is important to not have your availability of calcium or magnesium completely overwhelm the other. You want to have them in a rough balance. But those are, I have not seen very many cranberry marshes that have anything out of the ordinary in the calcium magnesium realm. So usually we can roll along and assume that we're in all right shape there as long as our soil tests come out looking nice. Diffusion is the other major method of transport of nutrient to the plant. And so that is areas of high concentration have a lot of our salt or our ion, and areas of low concentration don't have a lot. And you'll remember from elementary chemistry that particles that are in high concentration diffuse to areas where they're in low concentration. And as the plant root is continually uptaking these nutrients, so your potassiums especially, there will be lower concentration around the plant, and so the potassium will move from those high concentration areas to the low concentration areas where your plant root is able to seize them and carry them up to the plant. Yeah, this is obviously dependent on how warm it is. This happens better in warmer temperatures and happens less well in cool temperatures, which is part of why, as we are coming out of dormancy, our plant is still relying on the nutrient stores that they had made last fall. As our soils warm up enough for roots to be able to take up nutrients, that is as we are breaking dormancy, and kind of at the same time we start to photosynthesize again, we start to be able to pull in nutrients from the soil again. As I was just talking about, so the plant reserves are where the plant has stored nutrients in the vine for itself to recycle later, kind of in the same way that a squirrel is eating a whole bunch of extra acorns in the fall. Our plants are taking in a lot of extra nutrients, storing them in the roots, storing them in the vines. And then after the ice goes out in the winter, we start to need nutrients again, we start to need to grow, but the plant doesn't want to rely on the fact that the soil temperature might not be ready for it yet. So it needs to have those reserves in-house in storage to be able to deploy right away. The soil solution is then where after we've run out of our plant reserves, and hopefully we don't have to ever run out of our plant reserves. It's obviously stressful for the plant to use up too many of its own reserves. So the soil solution is where we'll get a large portion of our nutrients. And then we'll have basically kind of in that same, in that same method by which things go from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration. They'll also go from a form where they're in high concentration to a form where they're in low concentration. So the soil exchange sites, as the soil solution becomes depleted by the plants, the soil exchange sites will release more nutrients to the soil solution. As the soil exchange sites become depleted, organic compounds are actually always being broken down during high temperatures in peaty beds with high organic matter. And so they're always kind of making new nutrients available, but that's a very temperature dependent and organic matter presence dependent process. And then the soil mineral fraction very, very, very slowly breaks down to be plant available. We're going to talk about nutrient availability. So the soil pH, the cation exchange capacity, the soil texture, and the soil biology are major factors that are going to make nutrients available to our plants. Soil pH, obviously, we love 4.2 to 4.5. I'm about to show you the classic nutrient availability across various pH ranges chart, but you'll notice that iron and manganese and aluminum are well available in our low pH soils, whereas we do not have as good availability of phosphorus, magnesium, calcium, and molybdenum. Nitrogen, as I was saying earlier, exists in that ammonium form, and cranberries take up ammonium. So that is great for us and great for the environmental story that cranberries can tell the world how we're very good nitrogen stewards, and we don't, release nitrates because our soil pHs are low, and they let that nitrogen hang out in the soils until it is used by plants. So as you can see, every other plant in the world loves to live at 6.5 to 7, where all nitrogen is nitrates, potassium, phosphorus, sulfur, everything is peak availability in the neutral zone. And cranberries evolved in this very harsh part of the world where nitrogen is actually still available as ammonium, not as nitrate, but potassium availability is not as good. Phosphorus availability is not as good. We have a really non-standard nutrient realm compared to any other crop, and our plants are great at thriving. In terms of cation exchange capacity, then we talked about pH having that standard availability of how well or how how many hydrogens and how many hydroxides are in soil solution to bond with various ions. And we, of course, in our acidic realms are very, very heavy on the hydrogens and very low on the hydroxides. So cation exchange capacity is the ability of soil, I kind of think, the ability of soil to hang on to ions that are not currently in use. So sand is very big and coarse and does not have an electrical charge. So any ion that's floating around by sand will just kind of continue to float around. Whereas clay has an electrical charge. So ions will stick to the surface of clay in kind of a medium strong way, in such a way that plants can steal it back away again. A plant can crave that nutrient more than the clay does. And then the clay will kind of hold the nutrient as a placekeeper. We obviously don't have a lot of clay in cranberry marshes. We do have plenty of organic matter, and organic matter also has charges and will hold nutrients. So it has actually two ways of delivering nutrients to cranberries. One is through just holding by having a charge. The other is by having the biological activity actually break down and release new nutrients. But these exchange sites are going to be able to hold ammonium, potassium, calcium, and magnesium. And if we have high CEC soils, so generally in cranberries, that means if we have high organic matter, we will have less cation leaching. So the fact that the organic matter is holding those nutrients in place prevents them from leaving in our exit water. Yes, and they're readily available for plant uptake. I'm gonna glance at my time here. So this is, I guess, just kind of a visual display. If I'm going to imagine that these with the bold edge are organic matter and these with the not bold edge are sand. The organic matter is holding, it's got negative charges, so it is holding these positive cations in place, whereas the sand doesn't have a charge, so it exerts no force, and so the ions are able to just leach out. That's going to be important when you're considering your own personal nutrient plan, is how much sand versus how much organic matter you have available on site. If you have a lower holding capacity, you're going to be able to add less nutrients at a time without losing it. So you'll have to go out in more frequent, smaller doses. And that is, I've pretty well already said those things. And as well in cranberries, we're generally fairly sand to loamy sand, occasionally some sandy loams. We are going to have low CECs relative to clayier soils. We have large pores. We don't have a lot of water holding capacity, so water moves rapidly through the profile. And one thing that is, I remember as I was growing up, always kind of scratching my head at the soil texture triangle, because the marsh that I grew up on was very peaty, and peat isn't part of this triangle. Where does it fit? And it's just kind of another axis that boosts your cation exchange capacity. It does boost your water holding capacity a lot. There is those who have very sandy marshes tend to find benefit in having tile drainage as well as irrigating frequently and kind of having a constant throughput of water, where those who have peaty marshes are able to have the soil water profile just kind of remain without a lot of intervention. You don't need to recharge it, you don't need to drain it, it just kind of is doing its thing. The drawback, of course, is that you have a lower root penetration into the soil. But that's our fun low pH cranberry world. So organic matter, again, in cranberry, this can be more than 10% of our soil. This is basically our main location where we get cation exchange capacity. And then also the decomposition of organic matter adds nutrients to the soil. During the warm parts of the summer, our organic matter is generally, especially in production cranberries, composed of the cranberry leaves from prior seasons. And cranberry leaves have that very waxy coating. It takes a while for them to be able to break down, but when microbes are able to penetrate that waxy coating and start to digest the cellulose that's in the prior year cranberry leaves, mixed with a little bit of nitrogen, they're able to produce new ammonium for us. And then that discrete individual prior year cranberry leaf becomes future year's peat through that biological process. And it releases nitrogen for us at the same time. And if you've already put down enough nitrogen and then your organic matter fraction gives you more nitrogen, you can be sad because you now have more nitrogen than you had wanted. So this is going to be a discussion kind of based on Wisconsin soils, and I'm happy to take extra information from the chat if anyone has, well, here's how it is in the Maritime provinces, because I haven't been to the Maritime provinces yet. I'm looking forward to when I have an opportunity, but I'll be able to give more direct discussion at that point. But in general, we have our new plantings are put in with maybe a 1-foot sand lift, and then over time, you'll get the striations of an organic layer from 4 to 5 years of fallen leaves, followed by the 1/2-inch sand layer, which, hey, conveniently, a 1 centimeter sand layer when we add sand in the winter. And then we'll have another layer of fallen leaves that become organic matter, another centimeter sand layer, and up to that soil surface. So over time, the more organic matter we get, the higher CEC we get. So for those of you, I know a lot of Maritime Province marshes went in the early 90s. As you develop from new beds to teenage beds to mature beds, you will see your organic matter percents raise. You will need to dial back your nitrogen inputs accordingly, because you're going to have that nitrogen supplied by the organic matter already. And so that'll be something that will be more and more salient in the coming years. You will lose fewer nutrients to downward leaching as you have that more organic matter that's going to hold more anions in the solution. And you'll have increased water holding capacity as well. So you may also notice yourself needing to do less irrigation than you had when your beds were new. I'm going to check my time again. Very good. So soil biology is the kind of fun new world, right? We've known about soil physics for centuries. We've known about soil chemistry for, decades. And we are just starting to get the tools that are really able to measure and learn about soil biology. So some of the things we've been doing in Wisconsin lately, we've got our new microbiologist is doing a kind of a census of what mycorrhiza live in the soil solution, both for conventional cranberries and for organic cranberries and for cranberries that are found in wild bogs. And so we're seeing what mycorrhiza partnerships exist in these 3 different realms. And if there are any that exist in wild bogs that aren't in our commercial production anymore, that we might be able to, it turns out this has a great improvement at potassium uptake, for example, and then we might find uses for that. It's also just kind of useful and interesting to know the differences in those 3 realms. So mineralization that I already talked about is the standard process where bacteria break down soil organic matter and release ammonium. But then our ericoid mycorrhizal fungi, these are the fungi that live basically exactly on the surface of the cranberry root. And ericoid roots don't have root hairs, compared with all other vascular plants have root hairs that do that main job of attracting and binding ions in the soil solution. Ericoids don't have root hairs, and to kind of make up for what would otherwise be a handicap, they have these really strong partnerships with these fungi. And so the fungi hang out on the root surface and they preferentially grab the ions that cranberry plants want. And then they will, they'll actually hang out like in spore form, not activated, until they sense from the cranberry the, hey, I need potassium signal, or the I need nitrate signal, or whichever nutrient that mycorrhiza is tailored to work on. They'll get that hormone signal. They will wake up, spread around and envelop the root, collect the nutrient that the cranberry plant had signaled that it needed, and then the cranberry plant will trade some sugar for the fungus, and the fungus will give the nutrient to the cranberry root. And so there are all these processes, and earlier in the lecture I've been saying, well, the cranberry root finds and gets this. In fact, it's more complicated than that. Very commonly, when you look more closely at anything, yes, it's always more complicated than that. But these mycorrhizal partnerships are really how the ion is mechanically transferred into the cranberry, and is also why being low of nutrients produces stress, because a cranberry is giving up its precious carbohydrate reserves in the form of sugars to these funguses, instead of being able to have them as a reserve for themselves. So what does nitrogen do in our plants? We have basically, it's equally important for humans. Nitrogen is the building block of proteins. There are many, there are many proteins that are not, simply not constructible without nitrogen. Probably the most known and most important one in plants is the fact that it is required to manufacture chlorophyll. So without nitrogen, you cannot manufacture chlorophyll, and without chlorophyll, you cannot photosynthesize. Without photosynthesis, you have no energy for your plant. So it is absolutely critical. We have, so nitrogen, as you're familiar, nitrogen as nitrate is very mobile in the soil. It moves generally through mass flow, so simply as the water goes, so goes the nitrate. The form is dependent on pH, so we have ammonium in our low pH soils, and then the main sources are going to be our fertilizer applications, whether that's an organic fertilizer source or a chemical, mineral fertilizer source, or organic matter, as our leaves break down through the process of microbial mineralization. It's mobile in the plant. So if you have a nitrogen deficiency, your plant is going to take nitrogen it'll break down the chlorophyll molecule. The chlorophyll molecules is the wrong word, but it'll break down the chlorophyll in the prior year leaves on the old part of the stem. It'll mobilize that nitrogen and send it up into the plant and make new chlorophyll mechanisms in the newer leaves that are up in the top closer part of the canopy. So if you are seeing nitrogen deficiency, you will notice that in the older tissue, and that's part of the reason that we take a full SNP in our soil testing, in our tissue testing regimens. So then we have, I apologize for getting the chat in the way of my screen. So as we are, I think, intimately familiar, and I think a lot of cranberry growers can be telling this story to row crop farmers. If you're talking to the media, letting people know that while in corn, the more nitrogen you add, you have lower yields if you have not added enough. But once you hit this peak, if you have added too much nitrogen, they just have a straight line here, and they will continue to have the same yield no matter if they add the right amount of nitrogen or double the right amount of nitrogen. Whereas with cranberries, obviously we have very low nutrient requirements to begin with. And if we over fertilize, our plant will think, hey, this is a bumper year. I don't need to worry about reproduction. I'm just going to grow, grow and grow and grow and grow, and invest all of their nutrients into vegetative growth, which does not get us a crop and does not give us juice and does not give us sweet and dried cranberries. So we need to always be very careful to note exactly where our plants are in terms of their nutrient need and apply only to that level. And this is what I'm going to get into more directly in the second half of my presentation. If you over apply nitrogen, you will not only have reduced yield because of the excessive vegetative growth, you'll also have more rot, and you can watch this almost linearly. We'll also have more insect damage, and you'll also have reduced hardiness. And when the plant is given this like false signal that this is a time of abundance, it doesn't shut itself down well enough for the winter, and can result in damage. Oh, I have a question. Yes, also weeds. Very good, very good point. If you're overfeeding your cranberries, you're also overfeeding your weeds. All right, so be aware if you're at 5% organic matter, when it is 75 degrees Fahrenheit, and I apologize for not having converted this into Celsius, but a normal summer day, you can get up to 5 pounds per acre of ammonium per day. If you only have 0.5% of organic matter, so if you're a brand new sand bed and you've got no organic matter developed yet, you will be in the region of 0.3 pounds of nitrate per day, or sorry, of ammonium per day, per acre per day. And so these are something to pay attention to as your plants develop, as your beds develop. Okay, 23.9. Thank you, Jennifer. As your beds age, taking soil tests to monitor your CEC levels and your organic matter levels will let you know how you should be reducing nutrient inputs to account for what's being provided by your organic matter. And that's pretty straightforward there. Soil temperature, and I apologize again for having everything in Fahrenheit. Cranberry roots don't bother doing anything below 55 Fahrenheit. And I'm not sure if Jennifer will rush to my rescue here and say that that is, 20 so, or 20 something. If it's colder than room temperature. So soil and availability, as the temperature increases, the amount of nitrogen that's released from organic matter is going to increase. Okay, so 12.8 is the cutoff at which cranberry roots start to be active. Everything slows down when it's cold, and so there's no point in the plant being awake and trying to seek out nutrients when the nutrients aren't really mobile or available anyway. So both on a mass flow perspective from temperature, but also on diffusion, but also on a microbial availability, the amount of nitrogen available is going to increase the higher the temperature. And so you can kind of consider, if you are growing in muck in some of the older beds, you are receiving can be a very hefty amount of nitrogen per day. So some of your organic marshes, if they happen to be in muck areas or peat, may be able to skate by with very little nitrogen inputs, which is great in a year when nitrogen is harder and harder to come by, and might be a significant portion of your budget if you do need to buy a lot of it. So in order to determine how much nitrogen you need to apply, and this is what I'll go into in a little more detail in the second half here, we rely really heavily in Wisconsin on tissue testing. We always do soil testing just to keep an eye on pH, keep an eye on organic matter, keep an eye on cation exchange capacity. But if we find a deficiency in the tissue test, then we can look at the soil test and say, is the reason I don't have this in my plant because there's none in the soil? If you have deficiency in the tissue and deficiency in the soil, that means that you will need to increase the fertilizer that's applied. but it's not uncommon to have a tissue deficiency when you still have a soil sufficiency. And in that case, you need to work on availability instead of just concentration. So does mineralization decrease with age of a peat-based bog? I do not think that it decreases with age. I am saying this based on experience and my gut rather than based on research. Some beds that I have worked with that are in the 70 years and not renovated are still producing in a lot of cases, quite a fair amount of the ammonium that's needed for the cranberry crop. It could be, we can talk afterward, Gerald, to find out what your specific question is referring to, because there very well could be places, but I am not familiar with them yet. So I'd be happy to follow up with that in greater detail after. So we focus on tissue testing to find out if we've got sufficient tissue nitrogen. The timing of the sampling matters a lot. Over the course of the plant's life cycle, or over the course of the plant's growing season, it will allocate nutrients differently in the plant. So sometimes they'll be in the root, sometimes they'll be in the new tissue, sometimes they'll be in the older leaves. They can take them from the older leaves and put them in the newer leaves. The only time that cranberries are doing the same thing for a long period of time is when they are putting on fruit size in the second half of August and the first half of September. So we, in order to just be consistent, because I can't say, oh, the first week of April will always have the same growth stage of the plant. That is nowhere near true, and you guys know that, but it's a safe bet that if I'm going to take tissue samples the third week of August, that in fact I will be growing fruit, and increasing fruit size, the same as 2 Augusts ago and the same as 6 Augusts ago. The end of August, the beginning of September, we're putting on fruit size, and so we can confidently say we're sampling at the same growth stage year after year after year in order to have consistent results. So we like to see roughly 1% of the tissue be nitrogen. And she's, the note here is no need to provide more than needed. In fact, it is bad to provide more than needed. You will wind up with overgrowth and increased vegetation and reduced fruit and increased rot. So our nitrogen requirements are kind of depend on our crop growth and our history. I like to look at the growth of the current year uprights. And so you guys are familiar with identifying on a cranberry vine upright, the tissue is woody from last year's growth, and there's something that it kind of looks like a scar, and then the tissue above that is more translucent, and it is less woody, and it's obviously a little more fragile, a little more sensitive. If that non-woody portion of the upright is less than 2 inches, and you have low tissue concentration in your test, then you are lacking nitrogen, and more nitrogen should be added to let your plant grow effectively. If you're less than 2 inches, which is too low, it's a little stressed, you should look for stress elsewhere, whether that's pest or drainage or drought or frost or some other limiting factor. But if you have high tissue concentration and short current season growth, you likely have stress from something else. If you have 2 to 4 inches of your current season upright and you have sufficient tissue concentrations, you're doing great. If you have 2 to 4 inch uprights and you are having either sufficient and getting higher or high concentrations, you might try making your first fertilizer application a little later in the cranberry growth stage than you have been in the past. If you've got very tall current year uprights and you've got low tissue concentration, you might need to reduce your nitrogen rate and avoid early application. So we might be putting this on before the plant is ready to take it up. Also, if you have obviously high tissue concentrations and tall uprights, you are losing yield, you are overgrowing vegetatively, so it is time to reduce that nitrogen rate. Application time. Oh, and one more point that I'll make at this, when you are looking at your cranberry growth, and when you are looking at your upright color, it's important to be really consistent in how you take your measurements. And I say take your measurements because it is actually a very, it might feel like you're standing on the dike looking at your vines, but you are in fact making important decisions. So I have growers who say, I always look at noon. I always look with the sun standing to my back so that I have the same sunlight patterns, just to know that it's really consistent. And when I'm making especially color judgments of my tissue, my current year uprights, that I'm seeing the same thing today as I was seeing tomorrow. Application time, obviously you need to wait till soil temperatures are greater than 55 Fahrenheit, which I can check back and see that Jennifer gave me the good old 12.8 Celsius. You want to apply during active plant growth stages. I actually have been advocating, especially after talking with growers lately, of waiting till fruit set to make first applications. Whether you have some nitrogen being provided by your organic matter early, or whether you have quick uptake. I've seen a lot of people wait till they have pea-sized berries to start making their first application. And then when the buds for the following year are being set, obviously you do not want your plant to be deficient at that time. We've actually been doing some research with Dr. Amaya Atucha, looking at fall applications. In order to, the old wisdom was that making late season fertilizer applications would result in failure to harden off and failure to go dormant. We've not seen that to the extent that the old wisdom suggested. We do want to keep our application less than 10% of the year's total, and only in cases where you want to correct a deficiency. So if you had a lot of leaf drop from winter damage in a prior year, it might be beneficial to give those plants kind of an extra boost during the time that they are developing their roots. Giving the squirrel a few extra acorns for the fall. New beds versus established beds. We can apply slow release nitrogen at planting, but our new planted cuttings don't have roots for 2 to 3 weeks. And obviously sand doesn't hold nitrogen very well. So very low rates should be applied every 10 to 20 days, but very, very low rates. And then for established beds, apply nitrogen based on the tissue analysis and on your observations. I'm actually, since we are at about, it's my 10 o'clock, which means your noon, which I think means we have 30 minutes left. I'm going to kind of go quickly through phosphorus and get to the second portion of the session, which is on what Wisconsin growers have been doing. But just being aware, of course, that phosphorus is a major water quality issue. We need to be careful to not over apply phosphorus in cranberries. It is poorly available and it's not very mobile. So you may, feel that you are struggling to achieve enough phosphorus. But the stronger your roots are, the better you will be at uptaking that phosphorus. And it's important to use either 2-to-1 nitrogen phosphorus blends or 1-to-1 nitrogen phosphorus blends, but never have a higher phosphorus than nitrogen blend for cranberry application. I will zip through here and we can come back to phosphorus after we've gone through our updates from Wisconsin. I am gonna touch on tissue testing again, of course, though. Always tissue test along with plant growth and plant appearance, and keep things in sufficient range. Do this every year and then track your relationships between your crop performance and your nutrient status. And yeah, of course, as an engineer, I really like measuring things. I really like boots on the ground observations. Spend time down in your vines. Know what they look like when they're feeling good. Know what they look like when they're under stress, so that you can correct it. I will go through a little bit of that. So ammonium uptake and organic matter mineralization starts to happen when soil temps are greater than 12.8 Celsius. You want to apply most of your nitrogen during the high plant demand. Phosphorus, soluble P gets bound up very quickly and released very slowly. And we are at risk of phosphorus loss during flooding and high moisture times. Potassium, you're always kind of threading the needle. You need that to be well hydrated and not under drought stress, but too much can lead to fruit rot. And so balance that with magnesium and calcium, which compete with its uptake. And so a lot of Wisconsin growers will do a 2-to-1 nitrogen and phosphorus blend in the fruit set and bud set period, and then later in August do a little bit of potassium kind of by itself. I really do soil analysis every year along with my tissue samples. I'm out there, I'm taking the samples, I might as well just grab them. But do bear in mind that soil nutrient content does not mean the same thing as cranberry plant availability. All of the soil tissues, all of the soil nutrient tests were developed with row crops in mind. Sufficient in a lot of cases means what average cornfields have. And so we want to look at the soil test as a second means of information after our tissue test. If we have a low tissue test, then we can say, is my tissue test low because I have low availability in the soil? If and only if you have low availability in the soil too, then it might be time to increase your application rates. So I wanted to talk a little bit about, we've been having these conversations in Wisconsin lately, focusing on, as we said, that nitrogen for bearing cranberries in North America came out in 2000. Since then, we've been doing a lot of work on timing of applications and then also different recommendations by cultivar. So if you have Stevens versus if you have Mullica Queens, being aware that the published recommendations for Stevens might be insufficient for full yields for Mullica Queens. This is an extension presentation. It is not original research. So as I come out, as Amaya comes out with more formal publication results like those fall application studies, I will catch up with you on those. This is discussions with, this is based on discussions with growers. And a quick note on soil types, Wisconsin is 75% of that sanded organic, like I showed that image of earlier, usually a 12-inch stand lift on renovated beds. In the Maritime provinces, if you don't have that, do not take my word as gold. Instead, use my word to inform and help you choose how you are making your evaluations of the physical on-bed checks that you're making. Always, trust yourself most. Consider the organic matter contribution to available nitrogen and consider to what degree you might need to water in. A lot of the sanded growers in Wisconsin do watering in, but that's not necessarily as, that can change based on your soil. So for the timing of applications, a lot of the Wisconsin growers are working in a 3-week window, beginning when you first see berries. And that can mean, that has the tendency to mean different things to different people. But wait till there are berries available before you're making those applications. You may not see a growth response after the first application. Make a second application and watch for that response, and adjust up and down based on the response and the crop potential. We are still talking about applications for bud set, whether that, does it boost the next crop, or does it reduce hardiness? Does it boost the next crop and reduce hardiness? That's still an ongoing subject of discussion among Wisconsin growers, and so would be curious to hear your takes in that as well. Timing and composition, as we had kind of said, watching tissue testing, most Wisconsin growers are not seeing phosphorus deficiency. So we're pretty much making our fertilizer decisions based on our nitrogen, our growth observations, and then the nitrogen tissue test, the crop projection. So what did I yield last year and what did I yield 2 years before, along with that visual plant inspection. That's really the cornerstone. We're seeing common blends of a 14-8-14, and then doing some 0050 or 0062 or a mix of those in the fall. We're seeing people do triple 14s. We're seeing people do 8-8-24, and that has you don't have to do the potassium additions later on. But as I mentioned, we have no one ever doing more than 1-to-1 nitrogen to phosphorus. There's always going to be more nitrogen and lower phosphorus if they're not equal. Avoid overgrowth is probably the most important takeaway of my entire presentation. You cannot go back and apply less. And I took that quote directly from a Central Wisconsin grower. You cannot go back and apply less. So always smaller applications. Kind of like when you're cooking, you add a little bit of salt and taste it, add a little bit of salt and taste it, add a little bit of salt and taste it, because you can't unadd salt. And so I have growers who will, during these this 3-week application window, might have the boom spreader running every other day on various, treating different varieties, but then also just going out with those very small doses. Reminders about your visual inspections, establish your personal convention. And I had kind of mentioned that for some people, it's, I want to see berries when I'm standing at the ditch edge, when I'm standing on the dike, or when you're checking leaf color and upright height, the same time of day in the same sun direction. A reminder that nitrogen is mobile in the plant. So the old leaves will show nitrogen stress while the new leaves are still green. So you need to get down in the canopy to evaluate that. Experiment with polarized sunglass lenses. And then a reminder that the important part is the growth above this year's crop. I've had people say, hold a firm line on the last application of the season, watching yellow tinge. So don't, it can be hard to shift your mindset to apply just what is needed rather than a little bit more. But hold a firm line and let yourself do what the plant actually needs, which can be less than you had been doing in the past. In terms of timing, I was talking about the research that my ITHS lab has done and will be publishing soon. And that's looking at that post-harvest in to encourage root recovery after winter damage. That one will be published soon, and when it's been published, I'll be able to share the results with you. Timing by variety. We are having, I have several growers that have multiple varieties on their marshes. The earliest varieties obviously are receiving their first applications sooner, and the mid and late season varieties are kind of following suit. We've got a couple different strategies for managing that. Some growers are starting their earlier varieties with a larger dose than their mid-season varieties, but going over them at the same time. Other growers are starting their earlies and then doing their mids and then doing their lates. And so that's kind of a logistics question, what works best on your marsh. But they might have a 50-pound app of 8-8-24 as the first dose for the Crimson Queen, while having a 25-pound app of 8-8-24 as the Benlier's first dose, and then kind of tapering off in the reverse order, giving the Benliers more and giving the Crimson Queens less as they come out of their nutrient uptake, most important nutrient uptake phase. Each variety benefits from individual management. Yeah, like I was saying, some growers have the boom out every other day during this fertilizer application period. And these are some variety trials at Valley Corp with Edgar Gillespie, as he is growing out more varieties to be tested. This is what I wanted to say. Update your expectations from 20 to 60 pounds of nitrogen per year. That's in Stevens for that 2000 research. Crimson Kings and Midnights, so those are two Gillespie varieties, are reaching their peak yields with 65 to 70 pounds of nitrogen per year. So that is nudging our higher limit up over where it had been with our 20-year-old research. Nitrogen is being removed from the system in fruits at higher rates in those newer varieties as we're getting the, and I'll try and say it in pounds per acre, but 3,000 pounds or 3,500 pounds per acre. We're taking more nitrogen out of the system, so it does need to be reapplied to maintain those high yields. This is just a blossom photo. And then I showed this in both presentations because it's so important, but multiple applications with small doses let you find this optimum rate. And that is going to keep your root rot or your berry rot low. It's going to keep your tissue in. Here, it's going to keep you from paying for inputs that are going to cost you yield and sit right at that optimum. So I will, now that we've got, I wanted to hit those. I think those are the more